Well, Australia's defence capabilities will shift dramatically over the next 3 decades as we acquire a fleet of nuclear submarines. In a moment, we'll speak to both Defence Minister Richard Marles and the Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie. But first, let's bring in Chief News anchor Mr Gilbert, who was there in San Diego for this morning's historic announcement. Kieren, you've done it again. Not one, but a couple of questions to a US president, and you were questioning whether the US, under whatever administration, would carry on these agreements.
Yes, Andrew, good afternoon to you. Good evening here. We're in Los Angeles now, ahead of departure tomorrow after a big day in San Diego. And yes, the question that I put to the President, there were across 2 opportunities. One was at the trilateral meeting with Rishi Sunak and Anthony Albanese, the other at the bilateral, but both along similar lines. The first one, can the United States be relied upon to deliver on this project given the long time frame? And the other one, a related issue, can AUKUS survive if another isolationist president is elected to the Oval Office? Let's have a look at those exchanges. Mr President, can the US be relied upon to deliver on this deal?
Thanks, President. Thank you so much.
Survive if there is an isolationist president? Yes. So you could see there, President Biden looked at me and he nodded and said yes. So he heard my question over the noise of the press pack, the White House press pack, and our Australian journalists, and wanted to answer that. He said yes. So he believes it does have that resilience to survive an administration, even if it might not be the same worldview as President Biden has right now at the start, at the birth of AUKUS. I put a similar question to the outgoing ambassador. This is his last formal engagement, Arthur Sinodinos. He wraps up next Friday. Let's have a listen. Ambassador, I asked the President, can the US be relied upon to deliver on this deal? He said we can always be relied upon, but I guess the backdrop of this is what happens if there's another isolationist president elected to the White House?
There's a very strong consensus in this country about going forward. Thanks.
So, Arthur Sinodinos saying there it's bipartisan. Kieren, explain to us just how this rolls out and what are the unanswered questions about AUKUS from this morning's announcement?
Well, there are still some unanswered questions. There are things that need to be nailed down in terms of the detail. But to give our viewers a sense of how it rolls out, we're going to have visits from 2023, rotations, not military bases. I'm sure Richard Marles will want to reiterate that when you speak to him. These are not bases. We don't have foreign bases on or international military bases on our soil, so there'll be rotations similar to what you see with the Marines in the top end. Those submarine rotations start from 2027. The first arrivals of Virginia-class submarines in the early 2030s, and then those Australian-made, British design with the US combat system, really that trilateral project that we should start seeing arrivals of those submarines into the 2040s. So it's a staggered, staged approach. As for the unknowns, well, for example, we don't know if we're getting new Virginia-class submarines 2030 and beyond. They could be used already by the US Navy. One senior military official said to me, though, they would expect that we get at least submarines of the quality that there would be a 15-year life cycle remaining on those nuclear reactors on board in those submarines. So they won't be clunkers, as the Congressman Joe Courtney said, but at least 15-year life cycle for those submarines that we get. But still, we don't know. Will they be new? Will they be used? Will we have to rely on some of the British AUKUS subs in the 2030s before we get our own Australian-made ones in the 2040s? That too was an open question in some of the briefings that I had over the last 24 hours.
And the big question, apart from the logistics, is the cost, Kieren. What is it and how do you suspect it's going to be paid for?
Well, in terms of the notes that we were given, the background briefings and the costings, it was done in the long term as a percentage of GDP, 0.15% of GDP every year over the life cycle of this project into the 2050. So it's a 30-year, 3-decade project, a massive expenditure. When the officials were pushed, though, they did give us a figure, a very broad range of 268 billion to 368 billion. So a wiggle room of $100 billion. It's not insignificant.
What's 100 billion
range.
between
So
friends, I guess?
Massive. Exactly. But that question you go to, let's say 268 billion. What comes in at 243 billion? The stage 3 tax cuts. So let's see. They gave us that number. Was it deliberate? Did they do it on purpose? Will they be having that sort of discussion over coming months leading into the May budget, Andrew?
I guess one figure's over 10 years and one figure's over 30. What other potential pitfalls could you see here to a deal that's over so many decades?
Well, there are many, but you heard the President in those answers to me answering what I think is one of the fundamental risks here, and that is in this country with its quite volatile political situation right now in terms of the divisions, not just between Republican and Democrat, but within the Republican Party itself and to be fair, within the Democratic Party. So will we get that consistency? Will we get that support? Right now, yes, AUKUS Australia, very well thought of on Capitol Hill in Congress, and it does have bipartisan support. Will that remain over the longer term is a question. Can these governments, can these administrations bed down the program sufficiently so that there is no turning back? I guess that's the aim of your next guest, the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles.
And finally, Kieren, tell us about the atmospherics of being there for that announcement, the 3 leaders on the ship. What was it like?
Well, it was a historic day there in San Diego at the one of many naval bases in the United States. But what I thought was interesting is only one of the leaders mentioned China in their speech. That was Rishi Sunak. But, you know, the backdrop to the whole thing is you looked out to the Pacific is that Asian giant. It is China. And privately in the bilateral meeting between Biden and Albanese, they discussed it. And I think in a bit of detail between the 2 leaders behind closed doors. So they might not have stated explicitly, but we know that is the context within which all this is happening. They talk about the rules of the road, wanting to maintain it. Which is the country pushing up against that? Of course, that's China, Andrew.